You're listening to a CNA podcast. Hi guys, I'm your host, Teresa Tang. If you've tuned in before, you probably know I record this podcast from Singapore. You also probably know I'm from Canada. I'm an expat in the Lion City, but before my stint here, I was an expat in China.
And I'm Teresa Tang. Coming up, keeping the faith with the Made in China ethos.
I was living and working in Beijing. Shanghai, though, is indisputably the country's wealthiest city. There are so many reasons expats are drawn to it, but now there seems to be more reasons keeping them away. CNA's Tan Yew Guan is an expat in Shanghai himself. He's CNA's correspondent there, and he joins me today to talk about this exodus, why it's happening, and if it's more than just a temporary trend. Hi, Yew Guan.
Hi.
When I saw that you were focusing on expatriates in Shanghai, it stirred something inside of me. I had these flashbacks to more than a decade ago when I lived in Beijing, and it was honestly the most eye-opening, enriching experience for me professionally and personally. And I had to leave China for other pursuits, but I always wonder, what would have happened if I'd stayed in the country? You have been living in Shanghai now for, almost a year?
Half a year. I started somewhere in late May. Yeah.
Okay, so half a year. For people who have never set foot in Shanghai before, can you describe what it's like?
Well, I must say that Shanghai is a very charming city. Funny enough, I just hosted a friend and he just left this morning, in fact, and he just wishes he could extend it. And before that, I hosted my cousin and they had the same feeling. Because Shanghai now is a very livable city. In recent years, the city has done a very good job in building beautiful parks and other amenities to make the city a great place to live. And on top of that, you have the historical bits of the city which were retained. So the city has a lot of character. It's not just the new parts, there are also the old parts. So, you have the brand new buildings at Lujiazui, which is like, it just wows you away. But then you also have the very quaint cafes and nice bits of Shanghai. Like even in my neighborhood, I have this very old, what they call Shikumen, which they restored, and then now it's like a little nice area of cafes and restaurants and stuff. And it's just nice to walk there sometimes, even if you're broke and you just want to have a nice place to walk. You can enjoy the city even with very little money in that way. And as one of my interviewees put it, it's also very safe. And when you're in a very safe place, just like, there in Singapore, your brain can be deployed to do other more creative pursuits. Life becomes full of possibilities. You can meet up with people, you can, create ideas and stuff. And what's more, the people are very friendly.
Sounds like you've adjusted pretty well to life in Shanghai, but still you've had to do some adjusting, find an apartment, familiarize yourself with how the city ticks, make new friends. How often do you come across expats in your day-to-day? What made you sort of stop and say, hey, there aren't as many foreigners as there used to be?
Well, that's really one of the first things that friends, expats, and locals alike, right? Or even car-hailing drivers will tell you. That's one of the first things. Oh, there used to be a lot more foreigners. It's like what they would say, they're kotou-chan, something that they keep saying. Especially to newbies. Once they know you are a newbie, right, they'll say, oh, the city used to be so vibrant, so much more vibrant, rather. It's still very vibrant, but they'll say, oh, it's so much more, right? Or they'll say, oh, this restaurant used to be packed and needs to be reserved way ahead of time, but now you can just waltz in and get a table. That made me quite curious, right? Like, what's going on? Like, really? Has there really been a drop in the number of expats? And, has there really been a big impact? Because when I landed, to me, it's a vibrant city. It's a big city. It's a great city, right? I don't see anything particularly wrong with it. And I'm also curious because, yes, I don't see a foreigner at every single turn of, But then sometimes it's also hard to tell if a person is foreigner, right? Especially if the expat is an Asian like me,
yeah,
right?
Good
You kind
point.
of blend in, right? Good point, right? And you don't really know until they start talking, right? So I needed to, I think I need to kind of investigate and see what I find. And what I found is that the official numbers are actually pretty hard to come by. Not because they're hiding it or anything like that. There's nothing nefarious about it. It's just that, to conduct a census is quite a lot of effort, right? Quite a lot of resources. And the last census was in 2020. I caught up with Melissa, and she's a headhunter, and she works for this headhunting firm, which actually did a kind of like a projection as to how many foreigners there are in Shanghai, right? Based on the numbers that some embassies have of their various communities, right? And what they project is quite likely, right, that the number of foreigners has dropped, right, at least by half. And through the years, it hasn't really recovered.
So during my time in China, I learned so quickly that the expat friends that you make, they become your family because you experience the same frustrations, the same delights when you navigate this foreign place together. You talked about what Shanghai is like as a city, but what would you say in particular draws people to the city?
Well, Shanghai is a moniker, magic city, and 魔都 in Chinese, right? And in some ways, pretty magical. I dare say in my half a year here, I know more new and interesting people than I know in 10 years at home. It's a
Wow.
hub. People come here from all over. And it's also true that folks here are generally very helpful to a newbie to their city. And because many of them are expats themselves, and they come from elsewhere in China. So they were once a newbie, right? So to them, it's like they're paying it forward. In my documentary, I interviewed an Italian chef who made a life for himself in Shanghai, and he calls himself Lucky Lasagna. He refused to give me his real name. He tells me that how Shanghai, in Shanghai, there's a community of chefs, right, who look out for each other. Right? And these chefs include those from China as well as those from abroad. And when you talk to him, you can sense really how much he really loves the vibe in the city. Let's take a listen.
When I arrived was wow, so I'm having the goosebump now. It was really the international city where local and foreigner were together with no any problem, just curious and respectful. An incredible energy and the most international city I ever been. The feeling was incredible. Downtown was 50-50 foreigner and local Chinese people. Super interesting.
Wow, I love that he has goosebumps just talking about his experience there. I have some Singaporean friends who worked in Shanghai for many years, and then Yew Guan, the pandemic changed everything. As soon as they could get out, they got out, and they told me they would never go back to China again after their experience with the whole zero COVID policy. From people that you've been talking to, what happened exactly? What took the shine off of Shanghai during that period?
I mean, as you know, I did not live through the lockdown here, right? My cameraman did. You hear people talking about it, right? They pretty much put it behind them, right? But there are people here who, for the lack of a better word, I would say it's almost as if they are still suffering a little bit of PTSD. Quite a number of them have already left. On Friday, I met another guy for lunch, right? And he's a tuition teacher. This guy was just telling me that, he doesn't understand what the fuss is all about, right? Because he says when the COVID lockdowns landed, he just read some books, did lessons online, and he just enjoyed not having to run around as much. Right.
That's interesting, yeah.
Yeah, and maybe perhaps because it's a character thing, he just loved reading books, right? So he had quiet time and all that, right? I also have expats and locals who say things like COVID brought their 小区 closer together, right? And 小区is like this neighborhood, a description for this neighborhood. Like for example, if you're condominium, that's called 小区, right? Down here, right? Because when the lockdowns was at its worst, neighbors banded together through the apps, like WeChat and all that, to help each other and exchange supplies of food, water, and various other types of necessities, right? But the lockdowns aside, there are also other aspects of Shanghai expat life that makes the city less attractive than before. One of them is the international school fees. Shanghai actually has one of the most expensive international school fees in the world. Right. In recent years, there have been a jump in international school fees in Shanghai. Shanghai now ranks among the top 3 in terms of international school fees in the world. The chairman of American Chamber of Commerce, I bumped into him during the Import Expo in Shanghai. And he tells me that, international school fees is actually one of the reasons why more senior expats with families are shunning Shanghai, right? Because it's become so expensive, right? And it's so expensive, even the companies are changing their policies, right? I caught up with a Dutch lady. Her name is Melissa van der Geest, and she's a client manager at Direct HR, which is a headhunting firm. And she confirmed that, expat packages have truly shrunk, right? Let's take a listen.
So a decade ago, we saw a completely different expat or foreign package here in China. There were a lot more allowances. So for example, school fees for an international school, a nice apartment and a car for the whole family. And compared to now, no school allowances, a capped housing allowance.
So that was Melissa Vandergeest, a client manager at Direct HR, a headhunting firm. So between 2018 and 2020, the number of foreigners in Shanghai dropped over 41%. Those are official numbers, right? We have not had another official census since, but Melissa's firm made projections and they reckon that the numbers did not recover. In fact, they are just about over half of what they were before the pandemic. That said, the pandemic isn't the sole reason. I mentioned earlier, of course, the international school fees. There are other reasons. Like when I did a call out on Facebook for this documentary among the Shanghai expat Facebook group, asking for the reasons behind the, shrinking expat community. And some expats cited tax changes, right? At one point before the pandemic, China indicated that it was closing the loopholes on taxes, on housing stipends, global incomes for expats who are China tax residents, meaning to say the income that they earn from outside of China. Those were, at one point, China was intending for them to be taxable. Those have since been postponed. But according to Shanghai International Services website, from January the 1st, 2028, that's in about 3 years, expats will no longer be able to enjoy tax-free treatment of housing subsidies, language training, and children education fees, which they used to enjoy, right? Previously, if this expat was lucky enough to get housing stipends and school fees included in his package, those parts of the package are currently not taxable. But come 2028, that will change. So that, that prospect hanging over them could also discourage some expats from coming, those with families and stuff. However, it's also not entirely right to say that no expats want to come back, right? According to Melissa, whom we heard earlier, there are former Shanghai expats who are calling her to ask her for jobs in Shanghai. So they left during COVID and then they now want back. But currently there are just simply fewer opportunities for them, right? There's just no jobs for expats, right? I mean, I'm sure that there are jobs, it's just that it's just far fewer. In part because of the slower economic growth compared to the decades before, in part because of the emergence of multilingual Chinese nationals, some educated overseas, who are taking over the job roles previously filled by expats. So it's no longer as easy a domestic market for Western brands as it used to be, which is why some of them are pretty much pulling out. And with them pulling out, the expats they bring with them also pull out.
A changing domestic environment for sure. I'm also curious to know, though, if external factors, so geopolitical factors, if they're at play here too. What comes to mind is the increasing U.S.-China rivalry, something we talk about all the time. Is that keeping Americans and other foreigners away?
This rivalry that's happening right now and all the sanctions that the US, all the restricted lists that the US comes up with, and even the tariffs on Chinese-made goods, they are also not doing any favors for American brands here, right? Because, the locals, the Chinese locals here, they will go like, why would I want to buy American brands now? They are against my country, right? So that kind of affects their sales here as well, right? Because they have choices here, right? But I did ask the chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce here in Shanghai. His name is Alan Garbo, and I asked him this question: whether the U.S.-China rivalry has affected keeping the Americans away and the American expats. And he says, of course, everybody's concerned about U.S.-China trade tensions, but the companies that his chamber represent, and this I quote him, the vast majority of them are not making any moves away from China. Right? He says that what American companies need to realize is that we are dealing with a very highly intensive and competitive environment in China, right? And these American companies have to adapt to that in certain ways because there is this tremendous buying power in China, right? And not everything that that is purchased by China overlaps with sensitive areas of national security. So that market potential for American companies are still there. Right, and it's immense, right? And the word immense is used by Mr. Garbo, not me. The import expo was over, right? In all, 11 deals were signed with a total trade value of over $700 million US dollars. That's surpassing last year's total of just over $500 million US dollars. And if you think about it, that's quite a huge amount, probably bigger than some GDPs of some small nations, right? And so, yes, there are fewer American expats here, but it seems that the Americans are still pretty keen to sell to China, right?
Well, let's talk about the dollars. Let's continue with that theme. Your report, it talks about the economic fallout of this shrinking expat population in Shanghai. Lifestyle chains that cater to expats, like the gyms, the spas, certain types of eateries, they're not doing well. What impact is all of this having on the city's economy, those particular businesses that focus on the expat population?
Well, if we talk about Shanghai's economy, the city recently had a news conference about the economy, and according to authorities here, Shanghai's economy still grew 5%, right, and surpassed 5 trillion yuan for the first time. That's about 682 billion US dollars, right? To put it in perspective, that puts it around the 20th largest GDP globally, right? It really blows your mind, right? I mean, it's roughly equivalent to the GDP of countries like Switzerland or Saudi Arabia.
Wow.
Imagine, right? Yeah. If you watch my documentary, you'll hear from a Italian chef, Lucky Lasagna, whom we heard from earlier, lamenting how hard it is to sell wine compared to before. Because, wine is a high value item, right, in a restaurant. And for some restaurants, wine is what makes the profits, not the food. The food is what attracts them here, right? And so some restaurants are not doing as well as before, right? Especially those catering to foreigners. And I spoke to one F&B insider whose restaurant serves up Singaporean fare, and he told me that last year, 2024 was his restaurant's worst performing year, right? And even during the height of COVID, business wasn't this bad. And it's not just restaurants, right? The gyms and malls are all affected. I hope your listeners would take a look at our documentary to see how one well-connected mall that's open for more than half a year already literally has no shops. All the lights are on, the thoroughfares are being swept every day, and yet they have not been able to attract any shops, save for a handful of shops facing the street. I did ask one of the lower-ranking city officials over lunch, how do I square the rosy pictures being cited by the heads of the city authorities and the ghost malls and the empty restaurants that I see? Now, she's essentially part of the city's department that deals with people like me, journalists and all. And she says that this is like the necessary pain that Shanghai is suffering because the economy is transforming, right? And she says that some lifestyle businesses will do badly, like, for example, those catering to expats.
It sounds a bit concerning. Is the Chinese government concerned about foreigners pulling out of China?
Well, I can't really speak for the Chinese government. If they are concerned, I don't think I've heard them saying it much, right, if at all. I don't recall any statement saying that, we are very concerned with the number of expats leaving. At least I haven't heard much from official sources about the shrinking expat community. But it is clear that the government is trying ways and means to boost consumption, of which the expat community used to contribute at least a huge portion of. They are rolling out all sorts of visa-free measures to encourage inbound tourism, which of course is one surefire way to boost consumption, right? Tourists come, they will use your spas, they'll eat at your restaurants, right? I mean, if you think about it, it's quite unprecedented for a country like China to unilaterally offer visa-free entry to some countries without any reciprocal treatment for Chinese nationals, right? But at the end of the day, to boost consumption, the country would need to boost domestic consumer confidence, right? But currently, there's just an elephant in the room when it comes to that. The one sector that is so big in China and also in Shanghai and doing so badly that it is dragging down consumption like a noose, right? A professor in finance explained to me what that was in my documentary. His name is Ling Han Shen. Now, he's an associate professor of practice in finance from NYU, or the New York University in Shanghai. Now, let's take a listen at what he says.
For many Chinese, probably upwards of 70% of their net wealth, their net worth, was tied to the property sector. At one point a few years ago, the property sector made up almost 30% of China's GDP. No single industry should make up that large a part of China's economy. The government has been trying to slow it down and shrink it.
So after all the people you've talked to, all of your research, what do you think? Is this just a temporary blip then, or is it something that's going to continue? What's your sense of whether an exodus like this could happen in other cities in China besides Shanghai?
Could this exodus happen to other cities? Well, that's really anyone's guess. But if the lockdown hasn't triggered a massive exodus already, I don't think a massive exodus is going to start happening now. Sure, if the economy tanks, then another exodus might happen, right? But China is still growing, right? Just at a much slower pace than it's accustomed to. One thing that's quite interesting to note is that I was speaking to a local and he works for Lego. And of course, Lego is a European company. And he's telling me how, consumer confidence isn't good here. But he's also kind of, that he's kind of aware that for his generation, he's in his 40s, right? They have actually never really experienced a true blue recession because China has been on a trajectory of growth for the longest time. So at the last time they had slowdown, the government actually poured money into it, right? Because they were trying to save the rest of the world along with it as well. But if projections from Melissa's company is accurate, right, in terms of the expat exodus, her company's projection does show a very tiny uptick from 2023 to 2024, right? So we're probably seeing the bottom right now. I mean, in terms of the exodus, I mean, the Chinese economy is facing a lot of problems, like the weak property sector. And so the Chinese government is trying to shrink it, that property sector, like Li Shen just mentioned earlier, right? There are also other problems like youth unemployment, which is really dragging down sentiment, right? And also the rapidly aging society. But the government is also proactively trying to roll out various measures to stimulate the economy. Some would say that China is in great decline, right? But others would say that China is in a great transition, right? If you look at how competitive China's AI sector is, for example, right? China and America, they are just way and ahead of the rest of the world, right? No one is close. There's literally no number three because number three is so far away. There's just no meaning in talking about number three. So if you look at the AI sector, you might think, oh, China is doing really well. But if you look at the property sector, then you think, oh, China is doing really badly, right? So we are essentially like blind men trying to fill up an elephant, right? And it really depends on where you place your hands or what you happen to touch. Because China is in essence that elephant, except it's a gigantic elephant, right? And we tiny humans can only sit and watch the drama unfold through as many lenses as humanly possible. Teresa?
I find China endlessly fascinating, and I love living vicariously through your reports, Yew Guan. Thank you so much for coming on today.
You're welcome.
And for more on the expat scene in Shanghai, and also to find Yew Guan's other reports on China, head to YouTube and also CNA.Asia. Don't forget, there are also TV episodes of CNA Correspondent every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time.
Yeah, speaking of CNA Correspondent, that episode on Shanghai is actually doing pretty well on YouTube. So I hope your listeners will go over to YouTube to catch the episode of CNA Correspondent on Shanghai.
Okay, you heard Yew Guan. Go and check it out. I'm Teresa Tang. Thanks so much for listening, and be sure to follow this podcast on Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Thanks very much to those who've already subscribed. The team behind this week's episode is Faiz, Saya Win, Clara Ong, Crispina Robert, and Craig Dale. Join us again for more next week. Take care.